there is a case that you cite in your report, Rachel, which I think is very relevant, is emblematic of how the scripture can be manipulated and interpreted in various different ways. It's the case of verse 256 of Surat al-Baqarah, and which is referenced in different documents and texts, from the Salafi jihadis documents to the Islamists to the mainstream document. How is it possible that this can be interpreted in such different ways?
So we were particularly interested in how different categories of content use the same verse in a different way. So when we looked at the verses that were most quoted by different categories, we were interested in the interpretation as well as what verses were actually quoted. So this is a prime example. It's a verse that talks about the fact that there should be no compulsion in religion. So essentially freedom of religion and belief is the core message of this verse. And yet it appears in four different Salafi jihadi material, Islamist non-violent material, the mainstream, and also in counter-narratives. So we were fascinated to see that this, which doesn't seem to be lived out by for example, Salafi jihadis, how is that interpreted, and what's the context that they put it in? And so this particular case study, I mean, in the mainstream and in the counter-narratives, they very much argue the freedom of religion and belief. And in the Salafi jihadi literature, what was fascinating was they actually completely ignored that part of the verse. Although it was quoted, they spoke about the part following it, the part before it, and just ignored the freedom of religion and belief entirely. So they kind of distorted it within its context. And then the Islamist approach was a lot more talking about, yes, there is freedom of religion and belief, but actually it's on us to evangelize, essentially, and to introduce people to the right way. And then they unpacked more of their understanding of what that meant. So it was very interesting analytically to zoom in on a specific verse and how it was unpacked. While the majority of our report covers the larger data, kind of more, for example, what's the number of times a verse is quoted. This was a deep dive into a specific verse.